We've already learned that anthropology is the study of human beings, and it's an extremely broad field of study. We're narrowing it down pretty much trying to understand what makes for human happiness. And we are going to be doing or contrasting a theological framework with a more secular framework, usually psychological. And St. Augustine represents the pessimistic school of understanding human behavior. Humans is driven by sin, by original sin that makes us selfish, self-absorbed, and only grace can rescue us. God's intervening directly into our lives to transform us, to convert us, and make us virtuous. But within psychology, there's a very famous school of study that also is relatively pessimistic when it comes to the human being. It's a name you may well recognize, Sigmund Freud. Freud is really considered the father of modern psychology. He lived pretty much late 1800s, early 1900s, and he was a medical doctor. And he began by studying the brain. At first he thought he could figure things out just through studying the physical brain. But as he began to counsel people, have people in therapy, he believed that pretty much all human behavior can be interpreted and understood through two forces. He believed that humans are driven, they are motivated by two things: libido, which is sexual energy, and aggression. So you can see right there in just how he thought he could understand human beings that it can look very pessimistic. Two forces, and both pretty much negative in the sense of it's how we dominate others, it's how we control others, it's how we express ourselves. And he really believed that it was a lack of awareness of these forces that kept us imprisoned, that kept us unhealthy. And so like a doctor, when he approached someone, when a patient would come to him, he would see it as your medical doctor would see it. You come in, you talk about symptoms, there'd be a diagnosis, and there would be therapy. There'd be some sort of, instead of getting a pill or medication, there would be talk therapy, what we call talk therapy, usually over the course of months and years, till you could finally get some insight. So for Freud, as we talk about these things, keep in mind, he did not believe that we could ever truly conquer these forces. We could only perhaps have some insight into them and perhaps thereby have some sense of control over it. So we're going to look at two major parts of Freud's system. And one is the layers of the mind, and the other are the structures of the mind. So when you think about the layers of the mind, I want you to think about an iceberg. Now, we all know that in the ocean, and when you come upon an iceberg, you're only seeing a tiny portion of it. A whole lot of that iceberg is below the surface of the water. And so for Freud, most of our behavior is underneath the surface of the water, what he called in the unconscious. We are not aware of it. We have really very little, if any, insight into it. That's where a lot of this sexual energy and aggression is. It's in the unconscious. Just below the water is what's sometimes called the subconscious, or sometimes referred to as the preconscious. That's the sort of stuff that you can retrieve with some effort. So let's say if I asked you, what did you have for lunch 3 days ago? You might not remember it like that, but with a little bit of effort, you can say, oh yeah, I had the chili, or I had the pizza. You could recall it. And don't mix up those two. A lot of people will use subconscious instead of unconscious. For Freud, we can have access to the subconscious. Now, the conscious is what we are aware of. That is the stuff that you can be aware of right now, where you're sitting, what perhaps you're thinking, what you're feeling. You can have some awareness of that. But remember, for Freud, that is the very tiny part of what's going on in us. We are being driven by stuff that's way below the surface, that we have no idea of what's going on. To give you an example, this can happen with teachers, it can happen with a lot of people, but let's imagine you have almost an automatic like or dislike of a teacher. For Freud, a lot of that has nothing to do with any kind of rational choice. We'll try to make it rational. We'll try to say, oh, it's because he or she did this, or he or she is like that. But for Freud, most of that is probably a reaction to some other figure we have in our lives, usually our parents. So perhaps a male teacher reminds you of your dad. And if you like your dad, then you're going to be cool with that male teacher. If you don't like your dad, and this teacher acts like your dad in some way, you're not going to like that teacher. But again, you're not probably aware of that. That is way below the surface of the water in your unconscious. Again, with some insight, perhaps you can become more in touch with it. It has nothing to do with that male or female teacher. It has to do with stuff in your own psyche, not in them. Okay, so those are the three layers of the mind: the conscious, the sub or preconscious, and the unconscious. Then we have what's called the structures of the mind. And these also are three: the superego, the ego, and the id. And again, it's somewhat a little bit like the iceberg, not exactly the same sort of configuration. But basically the ego is your sense of self. And your ego will always want to protect itself. So when the ego experiences some sort of anxiety, it will deploy defense mechanisms. We'll probably talk about that at a later date. You'll probably smile or laugh at them because we are constantly deploying them. The ego will protect itself from threats to its sense of self. The superego is really just societal norms. It's not like your conscience. It is basically what you've been taught to believe is good and right and what is bad and wrong. And your superego can be kind of punishing on you. You're a bad person. You're irresponsible. It's that voice. Sometimes you're not really aware of it again, but it's telling you you're falling short. You're imperfect. And you're never going to measure up. And you need to do the right thing. Your id is where, again, this sexual energy, this aggressive energy is really churning over. Freud called it a cauldron of burning desire. And your id, again, you're generally not aware of because your superego will be constantly telling your ego to ignore the id. And the id is always going to try to be churning these desires out. And the ego is sort of a referee. The ego is trying to keep both of them happy. And according to Freud, mental health will lie when you're able to pretty much balance the two. You don't want one of the two to get totally control of your behavior. But an image that's often been used by Freud is the id is like a wild horse, and the ego is like the rodeo rider. So if you think about that, how much control does the rodeo rider have over the horse? Not a whole lot. Even a very skilled ego, rodeo rider, will have very little control over this wild animal. Think of that image when you think about the ego and the id. The id is very powerful. So again, you can see that Freudian psychology is pretty pessimistic when it comes to humans. Humans are driven, and they're driven by forces that are elemental, that are based really for Freud on survival instincts.